Hi everyone, it's Vu. I think one of the things that isn't really talked super much about is our failures. We talk a lot about our successes. There's abundance of that on YouTube and on Instagram. And if you were only on social media, you would probably think that everybody is killing it and crushing it all the time. Whereas oftentimes a lot of our failures are really internal to ourselves. I figured I would be the change I would like to see in the world. So today I thought I'd share with you my worst mistake I ever made in my career as a programmer. So without further ado, let's get started. So to set the stage, this happened 10 years ago in 2011. This was my technically third job out of dropping out of college. And I was 20 years old. This was the first job that had senior engineer in the title. As a senior engineer, I was technically leading a small team of about 3 people or so. And this was a company that built a tracking SDK, a tracking software development kit. I guess that doesn't help. Essentially, what we made was a piece of software that app developers can integrate into their app. So we are the third party that will allow them to track ads, basically, right? What I was responsible for were the actual implementations of the SDK on the iOS and on the Android application. That's essentially what I oversaw. So this code was code that would be integrated in some of the largest apps at the time. So one of the big customers was, for example, Zynga. I think EA was another customer. Rovio, so they did Angry Birds. You know, we were working with a particular client, and this customer had this application that was very, very widely used throughout the world. It was one of the most popular apps at the time. I'm not going to say exactly what it was to kind of like obfuscate some data here, but it was a pretty big app. So already at this point, we had this application working in production. We had probably millions of installs without a hitch. Small bugs here and there maybe, but nothing too horrendous, right? Knock on wood, but you can kind of see what's happening here. The thing about building software for companies that are worth like billions of dollars is very oftentimes they're always going to come back with demands, right? Not quite demands, they're requests, right? But if you don't meet their requests, they're not going to use your application. And you know, oftentimes these are very reasonable requests. Like for example, maybe they have certain privacy concerns, or they have special authentication requirements that you have to build into the application itself, or else it's not going to work. Basically, I can't remember the specifics, but what I do remember is that there were some custom things that needed to go in to this SDK on a very short timeline, right? And there was really no choice about it, if I recall correctly, because there was like a timeline in which they wanted to push out a new, update of their application, and it just like kind of worked out where there's like this allocated slot that would make sense for them to test. So I remember before this, I was working my butt off. I was pulling a lot of all-nighters. I even slept in the office a couple times, and just to try to get this code in and trying to test it amongst as many devices as I possibly could to make sure that once the integration was in and they tested it in production, things would kind of go smoothly. The day of the test came and things went over fine. We walked through the use case of this SDK and we showed that it performed to the expectations. We tested that the data was coming in, it was all good. They took it through their QA, quality assurance, their testing, and then nothing seemed to be amiss. So then they slated it to be pushed to production, which then shipped it to the App Store and the Android store. This is when the proverbial you-know-what sort of hit the fan here. Basically, immediately when they hit production, they started seeing an elevation in crash rate. You also have to remember this is 2011, so the tools in which you debug this and even monitor your live crashing didn't really exist yet. I don't think like Crashalytics like existed yet, right? I vaguely recall getting an email that was just like, WTF, like what is happening, what's going on. Yeah, there were a lot of production crashes in the app that they saw once it was on the Android store and people started to update. After a few days of debugging and trying to see what was going on, we were able to pull device logs from a device family where we were seeing some of these crashes. What we saw was that the crash happened on a very specific Android version on a very specific device. Notably, this happened, I believe it was on an Android tablet. And again, this was 2011. Android tablets were like super new. What happened was that some Android tablets didn't have enough like compute power, or maybe it was something with not having the cellular chip. It introduced a race condition which caused the crash. Essentially, what a race condition is that you can think of it as like two pieces of code operating simultaneously, right? One code expects the other to exist. And normally that wouldn't be a problem because this code executes just fine, and then this one checks this and sees like, hey, are you there? Is this variable here, etc. But in this instance, because of the way this device was built, or like less like CPU, and again, we had a big user base in India, so then some of the devices were a little bit weaker. What ended up happening was this code ended off firing first, and then when it checked for this variable, it got like a null pointer exception and like threw an exception which crashed the app. The client was very upset. They demanded to know like what happened, what went wrong, blah, 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 blah. And in retrospect, quite a few things went wrong, but now that I'm able to see things more clearly, I understand like it totally wasn't like a lot of like my fault, right? Like I had a strict timeline in which I had to build this thing. I didn't have the most resources at my expenditure to test this as thoroughly as we can. And even if we tested this completely thoroughly, like it happened on a specific slice of device, like we didn't even think about testing on Android tablets. And then an argument could be made too that they should have tested their application way better. Like what they wanted was a scapegoat. And at the end of the day, I took responsibility for this because, I was the TL of this project. I was overseeing 3 engineers, and the code that I signed off on, the code that I said was going to be okay, ended up not being okay. And even if that was preventable or unpreventable, I had to take responsibility for that, and which I did. And I think that was a very valuable lesson for me. There's going to be moments where there are mistakes that are happening. And I think the difference between someone that is a leader and someone that is not comes down to responsibility. I think because I stepped up and said, hey, I'll take this one, all my colleagues respected me a lot more. But don't get me wrong, it was certainly very rough. My company treated me very well. I didn't get fired or anything. It was really empathetic, very sympathetic. They understood what was going on. They understood that it was my fault. And I got a lot of support from my colleagues, as I said. But that client, they wanted to ensure this doesn't happen again. So basically what happened was effectively the worst 2-hour meeting of my life, where I had a meeting, basically me and like some other representatives from my team. And then on the other line was their VP of engineering, who probably oversees a organization of like 1,000 engineers at least. And this person was just ripping into me like how could you let this slide? Like what kind of engineering practices are you doing? Like this is ridiculous. You should have blah, blah, blah. It was horrible. It was horrible. It was one of the worst experiences of my career for sure. Definitely very humbling, very humiliating. But I think I also come out of that with a lesson of just like never being that guy on the other end, you know? Like if I ever was in a position of leadership and was communicating outwardly, I would never be like that guy who lost his temper and lost his, you know what. So that was like very transformative for me to understand kind of like the type of person I want to be. And after that, I kid you not, I had nightmares of that situation for probably the next year or so. It's not really as bad as it seems. It's not like I was like had nightmares and waking up every single week, but you know, after that experience, it was like maybe like a once a month kind of thing where I just like had this recurring nightmare where I'm just like getting yelled at by this guy, and it really sucked. Anyways, I know that is pretty sad, but don't feel any sympathy for me because I think now that I was able to learn and develop as an engineer myself, I can see that only for the good in it, right? Of course, the feeling was terrible, but I know at the end of the day, I learned a lot more about myself, and I have that experience to thank, right? So one thing is I always try to take very radical ownership and accountability for something, right? When something goes wrong, I try to step in, shield my team, take one for the team, particularly for those that report into me. And when things go right, I always try to give the credit out, not try to take the credit for myself. Those are the philosophies that I try to kind of live with, and it has done very well for me, honestly. I've gotten to positions of very senior management, I think because of my humbleness, humility, and responsibility. And a lot of this came only as a direct result of getting chewed out by like 10 people at a different company. So that is my story. And hopefully, if you found any value in this, definitely hit the like button and subscribe for more stories in the future. Thank you very much, and see ya.